Welcome to Walking the Torah Portions. I'm Tyler Merwin, and this is Torah Portion, MISHPATIM. This week's Torah portion is Exodus 21:1 through 24:18. The Haftarah is Jeremiah 34, 8:22, and 33:25 through 26. So MISHPATIM means judgments. As in the opening line of our Torah portion, it says, "Now these are the rules, or judgments, that you will set before them." Last week, Moses drew near to Adonai in the thick darkness while the people stood afar off. This week's portion continues with God giving Moses more details of his holy commandments. The sages have calculated that there are 613 commandments. Now this number isn't always exact. There's actually a lot of lists, and actually if me and you were to actually go out and study all the way through the Torah and try to figure out all the different commandments, we would all come up with different numbers, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But in general, 613 is the generally accepted upon number, and just as we say, the number 70 is kind of representative of all nations as a whole, even though there are more than 70 nations, and sometimes there might have been less than at the time. 70 is symbolic of the whole. So in our case, 613 is symbolic of all the commandments in the Torah. It may seem like a large number, but certain commandments are only for certain people or for certain positions. Commandments should be taken also as they're coming from a loving father to his children, and not an authoritarian cold decree that was made without you in mind. If we can always keep that perspective when we're reading the commandments, it really helps us to take them to heart, because really our Father cares deeply about us, and the commandments themselves are actually there for our protection. Now some of these only pertain to men, some only pertain to women, some to Levites, some to priests, and others just to kings, just to name a few. Now Yeshua was asked by a scribe, which commandment is the most important? Let's read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, beginning in verse 28. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked, which commandment is the most important of all? Yeshua answered, the most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord our God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one. There's no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Yeshua saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared ask him any more questions. Mark 12, 28 through 34. Yeshua answers the question by first quoting the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5. Shema is translated as hear, but it carries the meaning of to hear with the intent to obey, kind of like a military term. So if a commanding officer gives an instruction or a command, the people that are listening to him, they're not just listening to contemplate what's being said, but they're listening to act on those orders. So we listen to what God has said in His Word with the intent to obey, and we acknowledge that He is God, or supreme, and that He is one, or echad. We then proclaim to love Him with all our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. In other words, everything within us. Yeshua then adds, to love your neighbor as yourself, quoting again from Leviticus 19:18. This account is also told in a shorter version in Matthew 22, 36 through 40. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Some translations say, hang all the law and the prophets. So the structure of the commandments can be viewed like this. you have the two that Yeshua mentioned. Basically, love God and love your neighbor. So if you could picture a wall and you had two nails in the wall, one is love God and one is love your neighbor. Hanging off of this, we could put the 10 Commandments or the 10 words. On the love God peg, you could actually put Commandments 1 through 4 or 1 through 5. And I'm splitting the commandment number 4 or 5 with which is the being obedient to your parents, because that can be seen as part of one or part of the other. So however you decide to split that. The other side is love your neighbor, which would be Commandments 5 or 6 through 10. So you can kind of picture that in your mind, that these things are hanging off of there. Well, the other 603 commandments, which give more detail and minutia and understanding to the 10 commandments, are all hanging off of all of that. And they all together give more definition and clarity to the two of loving God and loving your neighbor. Because just like to understand, to love God is not how I determine to love God in my own heart and my own understanding. God lays out in His Word what it means to love Him and what pleases Him. So by us doing that, then we are actually showing the love to God. The same thing with the neighbor. It doesn't really matter if I do something for you and it makes me feel good, but you don't appreciate it, then that's not really loving my neighbor. If I do something for you that you appreciate, whether it makes me feel good or not, that's actually loving your neighbor. So let's get back to this week's portion. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free, for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Exodus 21, 2 through 6. The word here for slave would be better translated and understood as bondservant. There are two general cases where someone would end up as a slave or a bondservant. The first case is selling yourself to escape extreme poverty. This is similar to the Egyptians selling themselves to Pharaoh when they had no money or cattle to pay for basic food supplies, which would be their grain and bread. The second case is a thief who is sold by the court to raise funds to pay for his victims. They didn't have a prison system like we have today, so you would actually work off your debt directly to the person that you owed. The sages believe that this is the situation in this particular text. 6 years was the maximum sentence that must be, he must be released in the 7th year. Another picture of the Sabbath. Verse 6 shows a process for the person to stay with his master and his new family, quote unquote, forever. This is understood to actually be until the end of the 50-year cycle, which is the Jubilee or the Yovel, where all Israelites are to return back to their original inherited land by their tribe and family groups. It kind of goes into the idea sometimes there are commandments that can conflict each other, so you have to weigh out the heavier one is going to weigh out over the lighter one. Verse 7 goes on to discuss a man selling his daughter as a slave or a bondwoman. This would have been used by a poor family that could not provide a dowry for their young daughter and whose future life prospects were very bleak. The understanding is the master or the master's son would betroth and marry the daughter. It's also understood that this arrangement would be to the benefit of the daughter, providing for a better future for her, rather than the benefit of the family who sold her. God puts protections in place in case she is not cared for properly. One thing to keep in mind when reading the various situations and penalties listed in the Torah is that these would all be brought into a court and properly judged with witness testimonies taken into account. The Torah dictates that what would be fair what would be a fair and balanced penalty for a particular violation, which would be carried out by the court. This is not vigilante justice, with everyone doing their own interpretation of the law. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child comes out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, and the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Exodus 21:22-25. We will see this eye for eye, tooth for tooth statement a few different times in the Torah. The understanding here is not wounding the guilty party in like kind, but rather providing compensation, money, property, slavery possibly, that is the fair value of the injury. Trading actual injuries, when you think about it, can never really be guaranteed as equal. Say it was a burn. I did something negligent and burned you, and you had a nasty scar or a burn. Well, say the penalty was to burn me in replacement. So I get a burn on my arm. Well, my burn happens to get infection. It ends up with gangrene, and I end up amputating my arm, or it kills me. Well, that ends up not really being equal justice, does it? So we can see here the idea is to make sure that we are providing equality in our judgments. $1 million settlement for someone who spilled hot coffee on themselves would not be an eye for eye or tooth for tooth type of a deal. And some of us are old enough to remember that. The value should never be too little or too much. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. Exodus 21:28-29. We see here the responsibility the Holy One puts on us regarding even the animals we own. This also shows the sanctity of human life. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. Exodus 22:1-3. Since the thief is aware that the owner is home and will protect his property, they will also assume that the thief is ready to overpower and kill him if need be. In this case, the owner will not be guilty of shedding innocent blood if he kills the thief. The term, "but if the sun has risen on him," implies that it's clear to the owner that the thief means no physical harm, and it's more likely that the two may actually know each other. In this case, lethal force is not allowed to simply protect a person's property. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Exodus 22:21-24. God cares greatly for all people, but especially for those who are vulnerable and underprivileged. A sojourner or stranger, a ger, is vulnerable because he has no influence in the socio-political system around him. A stranger in a strange land who can easily be taken advantage of. The widow and the orphan too are vulnerable because they don't have any protection or source of provision in the ancient world and must rely on the giving and kindness of others for basic provisions. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak in a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. Exodus 22:25-27. We are forbidden to lend money with interest to a brother or sister in Messiah or in our communities. Lending without interest is considered one of the highest forms of charity because it preserves the self-respect of the borrower while giving him a chance to rebuild himself financially. Reminds me of an episode of The Little House on the Prairie where one of the young children from the Walton family goes to stay with an old Jewish man who's a carpenter. The Jewish man one time actually makes a very nice cane, and they go out on some runs and they go to a very poor person's house. The very poor person is in need of a cane. This old Jewish carpenter knows this, but instead of giving it to him as charity, he actually barters with him and says that he needs this old rusty bucket that he really didn't need, but he tries to have an exchange and see if the poor man would actually trade with him for the cane. Of course, they make the trade, and the poor man has a very nice cane, and charity was done. But at the same time, his dignity was kept in place because it wasn't just given to him. He actually made a trade. Even though we are lending without interest, we must still do it with a generous heart. Before lending, be at peace with not getting back what you lent. Don't hold a grudge. A person's cloak would keep them warm at night, and a poor should not suffer because of his loan. As we said, God watches over the poor and the powerless. 3 times a year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days, at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, and the first fruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field and the fruit of your labor. 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Exodus 23, 14 through 17. The Torah tells us to keep a Hag, or a Hagim, 3 times a year. A Hag or Hagim, the Hagim would be the plural, is best translated as a pilgrimage or foot festivals, where God's people are expected to travel and appear before Him in the place where He will place His name, which will become Jerusalem. There are 7 appointed times, or Moedim, or feast days, that we are to keep, and they're laid out chronologically in Leviticus 23. These can be placed into 3 groupings. The spring feasts, so if you look at the menorah, you would have the 3 being the spring feasts, and that would be the Passover. You would start off with Passover, unleavened bread, or matzah, and the first fruits of the barley. The center shaft is Shavuot. Here in our text is talking about the Feast of Harvest, and that would be the first fruits of the wheat. And then we go to the fall feast, which would be over here. So the fall feast would be Yom Teruah, or Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, and the Feast of Sukkot, or in our text it was called the Feast of Ingathering. The passage reminds us not to appear before the Holy One empty-handed. Protocol dictates that we never appear before a king without providing a gift or a tribute. Just as the Magi brought gifts to Yeshua when he was very young, we too should not appear before the King of the universe empty-handed at his feasts. The text also states that 3 times a year all your males shall appear before God. I think there's 2 aspects to that. One is that's the minimum. The idea we've already read before in previous Torah portions that the feast times are actually a time for the entire family, for men, women, children, for servants, for everybody to come up to the feast to appear before the Lord. But sometimes there's hardships, there's new babies, there's other things that can really hold us back and make it extremely burdensome to travel. So in those times, the males at least should appear before the Lord. I think another piece of this is appearing before the Lord could also illustrate the idea of appearing before at the temple or the tabernacle with your feast offerings, which you would bring at these 3 times. So either way kind of explains the idea of the males appearing before him. But this is not just a man thing. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression. For my name is in him. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. Exodus 23, 20 through 22. Here we have another manifestation of the Holy One. A messenger angel, or as we know that's a malach, who has the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in him. And he's leading and conquering for Israel. Could this be a pre-incarnate version of Yeshua? Our portion ends in chapter 24. We were taken back to Mount Sinai. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, you and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Moses came and told the people all the words of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. He arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Exodus 24, 1 through 4. When Moses told the elders the words of God, the commandments, they answered with one voice, or in echad, with all that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has spoken, we will do. Moses will repeat this again in verse 7 in the hearing of all the people, and they will also agree, even adding, we will be obedient. The understanding is not only that they were agreeing to what was just spoken, but also to everything that God would command them through Moses, since they personally had declined to speak directly with the Holy One. Moses builds an altar at the base of the mountain, along with 12 pillars. He offers sacrifices to God, and some of the blood is captured and sprinkled or scattered on the people, a sign of the covenant. Then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. Exodus 24, 9 through 11. The physical presence of the Holy One turned the stone of the mountain to sapphire. Tradition accounts that these two tablets of the 10 words, the 10 commandments, were in fact tablets of sapphire. The text seems to indicate that the elders made some sort of an infraction that was punishable by Adonai, but he stayed his hand. Moses is then called up into the mountain and is accompanied by his assistant Joshua. The elders are told to wait at the base of the mountain until Moses and Joshua return. They're also told to go to Aaron and Hur if there's any disputes before they get back. This is the last time we will hear Hur mentioned in Scripture. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up onto the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Exodus 24, 15 through 18. Let us all hear the commandments of our Creator and respond. All that you say, we will do and obey. And let us be bold and courageous to enter into his holy mountain with awe and reverence, to sit on the pavement of sapphire and behold the one true God. I pray this teaching has been edifying. Let's lift up the name of the Holy One. With love in echad, shalom.